Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful for You channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The opulent gardens of the Forrester estate, usually a sanctuary of manicured hedges and bubbling fountains, were taut with a tension that threatened to crack the very California sunshine beaming down upon them. Guests sat in stiff, perfumed silence, their jewels and finery feeling garish under the weight of the impending scene. At the heart of it all stood Brooke Logan, radiant in a gown of ivory silk, her face a masterpiece of hopeful resolve as she faced her groom, Deacon Sharp. This was to be her ultimate victory, a public declaration that she had finally moved beyond the gravitational pull of the man who had defined her life for decades. But that pull was a force of nature, and it had just arrived. Ridge Forrester, his silhouette cutting a dark, furious line against the vibrant floral arrangements, stormed down the aisle, not as a guest, but as an intervention. He didn't shout, not at first. His voice was a low, dangerous tremor, the calm before the volcanic eruption everyone knew was coming. "Brooke. Stop this." The words were not a request but a command, forged in the fire of their shared history. Brooke's composure faltered for a mere second, her knuckles whitening as she clutched her bouquet. She tried to speak, to assert her autonomy, but Ridge's gaze, a stormy mixture of betrayal and raw, unadulterated possession, locked onto hers. He dismissed Deacon with a flick of his wrist, his entire world narrowing to the woman he considered his, regardless of any ceremony. "You can't do this, Brooke," he repeated, the volume rising, echoing off the stunned faces of their children, their friends, their rivals. He wasn't just referring to the wedding, he was referencing a fundamental law of the universe as he knew it. They were destiny. This was a farce. The air grew thick, charged with the electricity of past betrayals, whispered promises in the dark, and the ghost of 1,000 Logan's Log scandals. Brooke stood her ground, her voice trembling as she defended her choice, her right to happiness, her freedom from the endless cycle of their passion and pain. But Ridge was a man who built empires on his will alone, and he would not see this one fall. He took a final, decisive step into her space, his voice dropping again, but losing none of its devastating power. He leaned in, and with a conviction that shook the very foundation of her plans, he delivered the 5 words he knew would change everything: "You are forever my destiny." The phrase landed not like a romantic plea, but a life sentence. It was a truth they had lived and relived, a curse and a blessing woven into the fabric of their lives. In that single, loaded sentence, Brooke didn't just hear a man trying to stop a wedding, she heard the echo of every "I do," every shattered vow, every passionate reunion, and the undeniable, maddening truth that their souls were irretrievably intertwined. The fight drained from her eyes, replaced by a horrifying, familiar clarity. The guests held their breath. Deacon's hopeful smile finally crumbled into dust. For in the hush that followed Ridge's declaration, the only sound was the silent, catastrophic shattering of Brooke Logan's wedding plans, demolished not by fury, but by a fate she could never, ever escape. The silence that followed was more deafening than any scream. It was a vacuum, sucking the air from the garden, leaving guests gasping not for oxygen, but for understanding. Brooke's gaze, once fixed on Deacon with a promise of a simpler, quieter future, shattered. It flickered over the sea of faces, Hope's wide-eyed horror, Steffi's knowing, almost satisfied grimace, Carter's pained officiant's expression, before landing back on Ridge. And in his eyes, she didn't see a desperate man making a scene. She saw the architect of her soul, reminding her of the blueprints they had drawn together a lifetime ago. Those 5 words, "You are forever my destiny," were not a cliché. In their world, it was the most profound and terrifying truth. It was the reason her first cup of coffee at Forrester Creations decades ago had felt like a homecoming. It was the explanation for why, after every betrayal, his with Caroline, hers with Bill, the endless cycle of hurt and forgiveness, they always found their way back to each other's arms. It was the ghost in every room, the uninvited guest at every one of her weddings to other men. Ridge wasn't claiming her as property, he was stating a fact of their existence, as immutable as the sun rising over the Pacific. He was reminding her that their story was not a choice, but a chronicle. Deacon, ever the pragmatist trying to play in a league of epic passions he could never comprehend, finally found his voice. "Ridge, that's enough. This is our day," he said, the words sounding hollow, a paper shield against a steel sword. But Brooke didn't even hear him. She was lost in the tectonic shift happening within her. The carefully constructed foundation of her decision to marry Deacon, built on gratitude for his support, on a desire for peaceful companionship, on the exhaustion of the roller coaster with Ridge, crumbled into dust. She had thought she was building a new life, but Ridge had just proven she was only building on a fault line that bore his name. A single, traitorous tear escaped, tracing a path through her perfectly applied makeup. It was not a tear of sadness for Deacon, but one of furious, resigned acceptance. She looked from Ridge's unwavering, possessive certainty to Deacon's crumbling, hopeful face. The choice was no longer between two men. It was between fighting a war against her own history and surrendering to the inevitable. Her shoulders, which had been squared with defiance, slumped in a silent, seismic surrender. The bouquet of white roses slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the grass with a soft, final thud. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The shattered look in her eyes, the quiet devastation on her face as she took a half-step back from Deacon and towards Ridge, said it all. The wedding was over. The destiny, as it always did, had won. The silence in the aftermath of the slammed door was more deafening than the shouting had been. Ridge stood, chest heaving, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of his desk. The elegant script of the design portfolio splayed across the floor seemed to mock him, their beautiful, orderly lines now a symbol of the chaos Brooke had unleashed. Taylor and Deacon. The two names clashed in his mind, a dissonant chord that refused to resolve. It was an impossibility, a joke in poor taste, a lie spun from the bitter, desperate loom of Brooke's jealousy. He snatched his phone from his desk, his thumb hovering over Taylor's contact. He would call her. He would hear her calm, reassuring voice deny it all. She would laugh that gentle, understanding laugh and tell him Brooke was just being Brooke. But his thumb froze. A cold trickle of doubt, insidious and unwelcome, seeped into his fury. The late nights at the clinic she'd mentioned. The new, subtle light in her eyes he'd attributed to their reconciliation. The way she'd recently been, softer, less focused on his every move, more content in her own world. He had seen it as a positive, a sign she was secure. Now, those fragments rearranged themselves into a damning mosaic. A guttural sound of pure frustration tore from his throat. He threw his phone onto the leather couch, where it landed with a dull thud. He was betraying her, right here in his own mind, by even entertaining this for a second. That was Brooke's power, her poison didn't just attack the facts, it corrupted your very ability to trust them. It made you question your own reality. He stormed over to the bar cart, splashing 3 fingers of amber whiskey into a crystal tumbler. He drank it in one burning gulp, the heat doing nothing to thaw the ice in his veins. This was Brooke's masterpiece. This was her ultimate revenge for him choosing Taylor. It wasn't enough that she had her own sordid history with Deacon, she had to drag Taylor into that muck, too. She had to tarnish the one pure thing he had left, to make every woman in his life tainted by the shadow of Deacon Sharp. The symmetry of it was diabolical. His mind raced back to the confrontation, to the look in Brooke's eyes. It wasn't just the glee of delivering a damaging blow. There had been pain there. A raw, authentic pain that, damn her, he could still recognize after all these years. It was that flicker of genuine hurt that was the most dangerous part of her lie, it gave it the sheen of truth. Damn you, Brooke, he whispered to the empty room, his voice hoarse. Damn you to hell. But the curse felt hollow. Because the true betrayal was taking root deep within him, and it was multi-layered. He was betraying Taylor by believing, even for a moment, that she could do this. He was betraying himself by letting Brooke's words get under his skin, proving she still had a hold on him that he could never break. And he was betraying any chance of peace by letting this rage consume him. He poured another drink, his mind's eye conjuring an image of Deacon, that easy, unearned smile, the casual charm that masked a lifetime of opportunism. The man was a phantom, a ghost of bad decisions past, and he was haunting Ridge's present, his future. To think of Taylor, his brilliant, compassionate Taylor, being swayed by that nobody? It was an insult to her intelligence, to her character, to their entire history. Yet, the doubt remained, a splinter in his soul. What if it was true? What if, in his single-minded pursuit of what he thought was right, he had pushed Taylor away? What if, in his righteous anger at Brooke, he had failed to see the woman standing right beside him? The fury crested again, washing away the doubt in a hot tide. No. This was Brooke's game. This was her manipulation. And he had fallen for it, hook, line, and sinker. By throwing her out, by reacting with this volcanic rage, he had played directly into her hands. He had given her the power. He stared at his reflection in the dark window, a ghost of a man superimposed over the glittering lights of Los Angeles. The betrayal was complete. Brooke had betrayed his trust with the truth. He had betrayed Taylor with his doubt. And now, he was utterly alone, trapped in a gilded cage of his own anger, the echoes of his own get out, the only thing keeping him company. The war wasn't with Brooke or Taylor or Deacon. It was within himself, and he had just lost the first, most crucial battle. More. The whiskey was no longer a bomb, it was fuel. The initial, explosive rage had banked into a cold, smoldering fire that etched every one of Brooke's words into his mind with crystalline clarity. He paced the length of his office, a caged tiger in a Brioni suit, the plush carpet doing nothing to muffle the agitated rhythm of his footsteps. Taylor and Deacon. It wasn't just the words, it was the implication, a fundamental rewriting of his entire moral universe. He had built a narrative, a fortress of his own making. On one side was Brooke, the tempestuous, flawed, and endlessly complicated love of his life, whose weakness for Deacon had been the final, unforgivable crack in their foundation. On the other was Taylor, the steady, the noble, the safe harbor. The woman whose love was supposed to be a reward for choosing right over tempting, chaotic wrong. He had framed his entire recent existence around this dichotomy. And now, Brooke, with the precision of a master saboteur, hadn't just attacked his fortress, she had revealed it was built on a fault line. A fresh, more insidious wave of betrayal washed over him, this one aimed squarely at Taylor. How could she? How could she sit across from him at dinner, listening to him talk about the pressures at Forrester, about his frustrations, about his hopes, all while harboring a secret connection to the man he considered a walking embodiment of his greatest failures? Every reassuring touch, every understanding smile now felt like a lie. It was a violation of their shared history, of the sanctity of the bond they had spent years reforging. He stopped at the window, his reflection a pale, grim ghost against the city's neon tapestry. He saw Deacon's face in his mind's eye, not the scheming villain Brooke sometimes painted him as, but something worse, a man of simple, uncomplicated pleasures. A man who could make a woman laugh without the weight of a global empire on his shoulders. The thought was galling. Was that what Taylor wanted? Was the weight of being a Forrester, of being his, so burdensome that she would seek solace in simplicity? This line of thinking felt like a betrayal of its own. He was doubting her, vilifying her, and in doing so, he was proving Brooke's other point, that he had put Taylor on a pedestal so high he could no longer see the real woman. The real woman who might, in fact, have feelings for another man. The circular logic was maddening. Every path of thought led him back to the same, inescapable conclusion: he was the fool. The cuckold. The last to know. His phone buzzed on the couch. He didn't need to look to know it was probably Steffi, or maybe Thomas, having heard the seismic shockwaves from his end. Brooke's confrontation. The world was already closing in. The whispers would start, the pitying looks at the office. Ridge Forrester, the titan of industry, couldn't even keep his own love life from becoming a public soap opera. He made a decision, the only one his pride would allow him. He would not call Taylor. He would not give Brooke the satisfaction of seeing him scramble for confirmation. He would not beg for the truth from the woman who may have been lying to him for weeks, for months. No. He would stand his ground in this furious, lonely silence. He would let them all, Brooke, Taylor, Deacon, the whole damn city, wonder what he was thinking. He turned from the window, his jaw set like granite. The betrayal was now a part of him, a cold stone in his gut. Brooke had dropped the truth, but in his furious rejection of it, Ridge had betrayed his own capacity for trust, for forgiveness, for nuance. He had exiled the woman who brought him the painful reality and, in the same breath, condemned the woman who was the subject of it. He was utterly alone in his gilded office, a king who had just set his own kingdom ablaze, left with nothing but the roaring, righteous silence and the terrifying, unspoken question, what if she was right? More. The cold stone of betrayal in his gut began to radiate a new, more terrifying chill, the chill of strategic calculation. The initial, personal wound was still there, raw and bleeding, but Ridge Forrester was, above all else, a strategist. He survived corporate coups, market crashes, and family wars by thinking 3 moves ahead. And as the shockwave of Brooke's revelation began to settle, the chessboard of his life rearranged itself in his mind with a horrifying clarity. This wasn't just about heartbreak. This was about legacy. This was about the Forrester name. His mind raced, connecting dots he had previously ignored. Deacon Sharp, the perennial outsider, had just been pulled from the periphery to the very center of their world. First, his daughter, Hope, had embraced him, bringing him into the family fold in a way Ridge had always tolerated but never approved. And now, Taylor? If this was true, Deacon wasn't just a nuisance, he was a virus. He had infiltrated the 2 most powerful family spheres in Los Angeles, the Logans and now, unthinkably, the Forresters. He had a direct line to Hope's influence and, through her, to Forrester creations. And if he had sway over Taylor, the mother of his children, the moral compass of his entire family. Ridge felt a cold sweat break out on his brow. This was no longer a sordid affair, it was a hostile takeover of his personal life, orchestrated by the man he least respected. He saw it all with brutal, paranoid clarity. Deacon, playing the humble, reformed man, offering a listening ear to a lonely Taylor. Deacon, using his connection to Hope to gain access to family functions, to insider information. Deacon, whispering God knows what into Taylor's ear about him, about his past with Brooke, about his shortcomings as a husband. Was this his plan all along? To use the women in his life as pawns to what? To get back at him? To secure a piece of the Forrester empire through some twisted, emotional proxy war? The thought was so outrageous it felt true. It had to be true. The alternative, that this was a genuine, organic connection born of mutual feeling, was somehow more threatening. That would mean his world, the world he commanded, was governed not by his will, but by random, chaotic chance. That Brooke, Taylor, and Deacon were all simply following their hearts, and their hearts had led them to a configuration that left him isolated and enraged. That was a loss of control he could not abide. He strode back to his desk, the need for action overriding the pain. He couldn't confront Taylor. Not yet. That would be playing the emotional, reactive fool, the role Brooke always cast him in. No. He had to be smarter. He had to gather intelligence. He had to understand the depth of this alliance. He would call Steffi. Not to accuse her mother, but to probe. To ask casual questions about how Taylor had been, who she'd been seeing, if she'd seemed different. He would pull Thomas into his office, under the guise of discussing the new collection, and steer the conversation toward Hope, and by extension, Deacon. He would become a silent investigator in his own life. A fresh, more profound layer of betrayal settled over him. This one was directed inward. He was betraying the man he wanted to be. The man who could be magnanimous, who could forgive, who could rise above. That man was gone, replaced by this cold, calculating general preparing for a war he didn't ask for. He was about to use his own children as assets in his campaign to uncover the truth about the woman he loved. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over Steffi's number. The gesture felt dirty, necessary. Brooke's truth hadn't just broken his heart, it had corrupted his soul. She had dropped the match, and he was now dousing the entire landscape in gasoline, preparing to burn it all down just to see the truth illuminated in the flames. The "get out" he had screamed at Brooke was now a mantra for his own humanity. He was evicting it, making room for the ruthless pragmatism that survival demanded. The bold and the beautiful was no longer just the name of his life's work, it was the definition of the war he was now forced to wage, and he was terrified of the brutal, ugly general he was becoming. More. The call to Steffi went unmade. The phone felt like a lead weight in his hand, a tool of the very deceit he was now planning. To use his daughter, his fierce, loyal Steffi, as a spy against her own mother? The sheer grotesquerie of the thought made his stomach turn. He was sinking to levels he once would have found unthinkable, and all because Brooke Logan had walked into his office and spoken 5 devastating words. He slumped into his high-backed leather chair, the fight draining out of him, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. The strategic fury was just another mask, another layer of defense against the core, childish wound, "How could they do this to me?" His mind, stripped of its rage and its schemes, drifted back to a memory, sharp and unbidden. It was a few weeks ago, a quiet Sunday afternoon at the villa. Taylor had been humming, something she hadn't done in years. She was arranging flowers in a vase, her movements fluid and peaceful. He'd been preoccupied with a design problem, barely looking up from his sketchpad. "You seem happy," he had remarked, the comment offhand, almost an afterthought. She had paused, her smile soft and a little distant. "I am, Ridge. I feel light." He had simply nodded, a grunt of acknowledgement, and returned to his work. Light. He had taken it as a compliment to their reconciliation. Now, the word took on a new, cruel meaning. Had he been the weight? Had his brooding intensity, his perpetual drama with Brooke, his all-consuming presence, been a burden she was quietly relieved to be free of? Had Deacon Sharp, of all people, given her that feeling of lightness? Not considering if she was tired of treading water for him. A dry, humorless laugh escaped him. All these years, he had viewed himself as the prize in their eternal battle, the king whose favor was to be won. What if he was just a burden to be managed? What if Brooke's truth wasn't a weapon aimed at him, but a desperate, clumsy attempt to shatter the illusion he was so determined to live under? He looked around the office, at the awards, the family portraits, the symbols of a life built on power and control. It all felt like a stage set. The real drama, the real truth, was happening offstage, in the lives of the people he claimed to love, and he was no longer the director, or even the lead. He had been reduced to a spectator, and a blind one at that. The betrayal was now complete and total. Brooke had betrayed his trust. Taylor had betrayed his idealized image of her. But his own betrayal cut the deepest, the betrayal of self-awareness. He had built a fortress of certainty, and now he was buried in the rubble, unsure of who he was, who they were, or what any of it meant. The fury was gone. The calculation was gone. All that was left was the vast, echoing silence of a man who had just realized the story he'd been telling himself for years was a lie, and he had no idea how to write a new one. "Get out," he whispered to the ghost of his own arrogance. But there was nowhere for it to go. It had already hollowed him out.